Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to Istanbul, Turkey, via Zoom. If you see the sun, it is lovely. This is CIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs, third annual conference on Islamophobia. The topic this year is examining the global war on terror, challenges, policies, and consequences. My name is Dr. Ubaid Ruff. I will be monitoring comments throughout this conference and forwarding those to our moderators. So as you are watching, please do comment and participate, and we will field as many questions as we can. Our moderator today is Dr. Hiba Rauf Izzat, who is currently faculty also here in Turkey at the Political Science Department at Ibn Khaldun University. She has been an assistant professor of political science and a deputy director for Center for Humanities and Interdisciplinary Studies at Cairo University. Egypt in the news this week with a very big, very stuck boat, which I understand is now unstuck. That's good news. Yeah. That's great. And Hiba has also been a visiting professor at Oxford University, not as sunny as Istanbul. And you've also been a professor in Berkeley, Georgetown University, very busy. Thank you, Dr. Hiba, for joining us. I'm going to turn the floor over to you and go to the comment section and forward questions to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ubaid. It's a pleasure to be heading this panel that is titled Unpacking Islamophobia's Consequences. And to welcome all the participants. We are having today Rizwan Sabir, Charlotte Cates, Nazarine Masoumi, and also Tariq Sherkawi. And we are going to start with Charlotte, inshallah. Charlotte is going to talk about law and the criminalization of political dissent, something I'm very much aware of coming from Egypt. And Charlotte is the international coordinator of Samidun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, an international network of activists and organizations that campaign for justice and freedom for Palestinian political prisoners in Israel, in Israeli and international jails. She is a graduate of Rutgers University School of Law. She is also the coordinator of the International Committee of the National Lawyers Guild and works with the International Associations of Democratic Lawyers. She also is a member of the organizing collective of the US campaign for the academic and cultural boycott and Israel and Al-Auda. I mean, the CV is very long. So I'm proud to be actually hosting this panel with all the good work you have been doing, Charlotte. So please take the floor. I think you have around 15 minutes to 20 minutes, as I understand. So try to stick to that. I hate to interrupt anyone who is speaking, so try to be careful with your time. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Rauf, and thank you to CIGA. It's an honor to be here with all of you today, and it's also an honor to be here, of course, with the director of the Institute, Dr. Al-Arian, who is himself one of kind of the emblematic examples of persecution by and resistance to unjust anti-terror laws and frameworks, particularly in the United States. So thank you, and it's an honor to be here with you today. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing specifically on the impact of criminalization in the Palestinian context, and specifically in the context of Palestinian organizers in exile and diaspora. There are many other examples that would be worthwhile to discuss in the framework of anti-terror law and repression, but I'm going to focus on this example both because the state of Israel and the Zionist project is so central to US imperialism, and because the struggle around Palestine is in fact form the basis of the framework on which many of today's US anti-terror laws have been built and created. Now, I'm going to be focusing primarily on U.S. law, but it's important to note that U.S. law is used around the world. Anti-terror legislation has become a primary mechanism to repress Palestine solidarity and Palestinian community organizing in diaspora internationally, based largely on a post-Oslo repressive legal framework that was constructed in the United States and exported around the world. And many of these forms of repressive attacks have been based on the creation of a list of Palestinian organizations labeled foreign terrorist organizations, closely mirroring the Israeli occupation's own list of prohibited organizations. And aspects of the same framework have been adopted in Canada, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and various EU member states, among other countries. And so this framework of criminalization also exists in parallel to a number of other Israeli state backed efforts to suppress Palestinian organizing, including anti-BDS legislation, attack on human rights defenders, and of course, mass incarceration and imprisonment inside occupied Palestine. US law has been used around the world to shape anti-terror legislation. For example, currently there is a major struggle in the Philippines against an anti-terror law that is being used to criminalize grassroots movements, worker struggles, farmers' campaigns, and indigenous peoples organizing. And the government's defense of this law is that it's based on US anti-terror law and therefore it's valid. So US anti-terror law isn't something that has an effect within the United States only, but it has an effect internationally. When we look at the United States and its role in the world, we can look at the US's list of foreign terrorist organizations as kind of a subversives list of a unipolar world dominated by US imperialism, or at least the desire for such a world. There have been in the past many anti-colonial movements, both within the United States and internationally, aiming to combat imperialism, racism, settler colonialism. These included the movements of indigenous peoples, the Black Liberation Movement, the Puerto Rican Independence Movement, not to mention the great anti-colonial movements of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And of course, these movements were often denigrated as communist, subversive, terrorist aligned, and various forms of state repression were used to target these movements inside and outside the United States. And the propaganda used was, in fact, very similar to today's anti-terror rhetoric that we see targeting Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities and organizations. And we can see as examples here the kind of propaganda that was used against, for example, the Sandinista Liberation Front in Nicaragua in the 1980s, or against the anti-apartheid movement and the African National Congress in South Africa during the same period of time. And post-1991 and in the post-Soviet era and the post-Gulf War era, the United States sought to establish itself as a reference point in a unipolar world. And of course, there are various challenges confronting this framework that lead many to say that there is in fact a multipolar world today. However, the presence and power of the United States continues to dominate and, in the words of Ghassan Kanafani, lay its body over the world, bringing terror and despair throughout the world. And one place where the United States has traditionally guarded its role as imperial overseer of the devastation of indigenous peoples' land and confiscation of their resources is the Arab region, and more specifically occupied Palestine, expressed through its unwavering military, economic, diplomatic, and political support for the state of Israel imposed upon colonized Palestinian land. And it's in this framework that in the mid-1990s, the United States set itself up as a reference for what it labeled the so-called Middle East peace process. That is the Oslo process in Palestine, the Wadi Araba Treaty in Jordan. And of course, this built on the same US-based framework that led to the Camp David Agreement in Egypt as well. All of these efforts were combined not only with this attempt to kind of push a peace process, but also to display the dominance of US imperialism and labeling and targeting of those who refuse to be compliant with this process. And that's what we've seen through the creation of anti-terror laws. The Oslo so-called peace process was kind of culminated on September 13th, 1993, with the signing of the so-called Declaration of Principles on the White House lawn. between representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization and representatives of the State of Israel. And of course, these negotiations took place under United States, not United Nations auspices, breaking from a very traditional kind of Palestinian outlook for justice, that it would not be possible to achieve kind of any form of just peace through US intervention rather than the application of international law and human rights norms. Now, today, looking back in 2021, looking back nearly 30 years later, the failures of Oslo in many ways are widely recognized and much discussed. We can say that there are, over 3 times or perhaps even 4 times by this point, the number of illegal Israeli settlers and colonies inside the occupied West Bank. There are nearly 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners currently held in Israeli jails. Thousands upon thousands of Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces. The 8-meter-high apartheid wall has been constructed, separating Palestinians from each other and their land throughout the occupied West Bank. There are over 7 million Palestinian refugees denied their right to return home, and those are simply those outside Palestine, let alone the refugees inside Palestine denied their right to return. The ongoing and deadly siege on Gaza, land theft, home demolitions, and ever more attacks on Palestinian rights. And so the phrase Oslo is dead is a frequent refrain, but its structures persist and live on despite the fact that it has clearly not brought peace or security to the Palestinian people, but only a more concentrated form of colonialism. And at the time, yet at the time in 1993, when Oslo was signed, the fact is that it was supported at the time by many Palestinians and Palestinian organizations. It was signed by the leadership of the PLO. And in the post-Soviet, post-Iraq War world, many had lost hope for the idea of a Palestinian or Arab, or for that matter, Muslim liberation movement to defeat Israel through struggle. And so these negotiations seem to provide some form of hope for independence or statehood. The Palestinian flag was being flown inside occupied Palestine rather than people being jailed for it. And of course, the Oslo process came immediately following the Great Intifada of the Palestinian people, in many ways confiscated the achievements of that Intifada as a mass popular movement. But despite the fact that there were a lot of illusions that persisted about the time about Oslo, which have, since been exposed in practice through what has actually taken place in the following 30 years, it was opposed at the time by a number of major Palestinian political movements and parties, including Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and many other political parties. And they became known as the Rejectionist Front, rejecting the concept of recognition or legitimacy for the Zionist colonization of Palestine, and pledged to continue the liberation struggle. So, Israel and the United States pursued Oslo in order to secure imperial hegemony and Israeli settler colonialism for the foreseeable future, and to establish the United States as the basis of reference for international law and international disputes, rather than the United Nations, rather than existing international law, rather than human rights norms and international conventions, or any form of multilateral body. And there was also, of course, this was accompanied by an attempt to co-opt the Palestinian National Liberation Movement into a subservient junior partner for the benefits of individual political or financial interests, and also an attempt to silence and suppress the Palestinian movement as a significant Arab challenge to US hegemony, not only inside occupied Palestine, but throughout the region. And so this history is important to understanding the development of anti-terror laws in the United States, particularly in how they have been applied within the Palestinian context, because the roots of today's most widely used anti-terror legislation derive directly from the attempts to shore up the Oslo regime in Palestine and criminalize any form of anti-colonial rejection. In January 1995, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12947, which specifically was aimed at those who threatened to disrupt the Middle East peace process. And it identified support for the so-called Middle East peace process as an emergency situation for US national security, foreign policy, and economy, and imposed treasury sanctions on this list of organizations, which included all of the organizations named above, as well as several other Palestinian political parties, as well as Kak and Kahana Chai, which is an important note. These names largely came from Israeli lists of prohibited organizations, as well as the membership of the Rejectionist Front. Israeli terrorist lists include a wide array of Palestinian social and cultural organizations, as well as political parties. And in many ways, the way in which these Palestinian organizations were described is the same way the Israelis would describe and define these organizations, rather than the way that they would be defined by Palestinians themselves. In terms of the presence of these ultra-Zionist organizations, extreme right organizations on the list, it's important to note that from the earliest days, the US's anti-terror lists have always included right-wing organizations, marginal groups, reactionary organizations. The presence of an organization on the list in and of itself does not mean that it is a liberation movement pursuing a just cause. It simply means that it is of some political benefit to the United States to include that organization on the list. But it's important to note in terms of application that the listing of Kach and Kahana Kai did nothing to list any of the actual extreme Zionist organizations that were active in 1993 and beyond, and have done nothing to quell the development of the far extreme Zionist right, and which has only been encouraged, including by many US-based groups since that time, and of course has never been used for prosecutions, mass surveillance, intimidation, and community-wide attacks in the way that these same laws have been used against the Palestinian community. And this was followed up quickly by the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, and has served as the basis for later anti-terror law enhancements. So for example, the Patriot Act is probably the most notorious US anti-terror law passed in the wake of 9/11. But in many ways, the Patriot Act was simply an amendment to the ADPA, the EDPA, passed in 1996. It was a repressive law. It also made it more difficult to challenge the death penalty, to use habeas corpus laws to challenge imprisonment. And in fact, most of the legal challenges to the law at the time focused on these issues rather than the so-called material support statute, which criminalized what was called material support to designated foreign terrorist organizations. And so this law transformed this list into a list of treasury sanctions of organizations that could not receive money into a list of organizations for which association with them could be criminalized and people could be subject to direct criminal prosecution. It moved the framework from this list from the Treasury Department to the State Department. And there are a number of reasons why it's foreign terrorist organizations, but it's important to note that foreign entities have fewer protections in US law than domestic entities. And so that's why this framework is always using the term foreign terrorist organizations, even if many of the actual prosecutions that have come out of this law have primarily targeted US-based Palestinian community organizing. Now, this isn't the same necessarily for all countries that have used this framework later on, especially in the post-9/11 era. For example, Canada's terrorist entities list under the Anti-Terrorism Act lists domestic organizations as well. Most recently, there was a great deal of attention to the fact that 4 white supremacist organizations were added to the list, along with, of course, a majority of Arab and Muslim organizations. But of course, it's important to note that this is not an improvement. Many legal scholars, lawyers, and others in Canada have pointed out that this will only serve as a further pretext to criminalize marginalized groups while leaving right-wing violence untouched in practice. Now, the material support statute, as noted, was expanded by the Patriot Act. And so the term material support, people often think, well, that means providing money. That's what material support is. But in fact, it's more broad. So today in the United States, the term material support or resources means any property, tangible or intangible, or service, including currency or monetary instruments or financial securities, financial services, lodging, training, expert advice or assistance, safe houses, false documentation or identification, communications equipment, facilities, weapons, lethal substances, explosives, personnel, one or more individuals who may include yourself, and transportation except for medicine or religious materials. And this was challenged in a lawsuit called Holder versus Humanitarian Humanitarian Law Project. And there was really an awful outcome in this case in 2010. It was a facial challenge to the lawsuit rather than a case in which someone had been prosecuted, and that may have contributed to the horrific result in that case, which upheld this very broad definition of material support Court and led to the Supreme Court introducing this concept of coordination and what coordination might mean in terms of advocacy, which isn't part of the law itself and is something that has been left undefined since that time, but has served to create fear. Further within this context, immigration law has also been a mechanism for even greater violations of civil and political rights under color of law, as in the Mazen al-Najjar case. Secret evidence has been used against people who are non-citizens in the United States, often deriving from Israeli intelligence and information extracted through torture. Material support itself has a broader definition in the immigration context. So while criminally, you can only be prosecuted for material support to this list of designated organizations. Non-designated organizations can still be considered terrorist for the purposes of denying someone a visa, denying someone citizenship, denying someone access to the United States, or allowing for their deportation. So these laws have had a significant impact on Palestinian community organizing in exile and diaspora. The Intifada inside occupied Palestine wasn't something that only happened inside occupied Palestine. It was accompanied by mass organization, the building of community centers, the building of community organizations, the building of charity work outside Palestine in exile communities. And of course, the majority of Palestinians are refugees, denied their right to return home for 72 years. And there are Palestinian communities in exile around the world. These networks of Palestinians in exile served as, and continue to serve as, a very strong basis of support for the Palestinian liberation movement and for the struggle of the Palestinian people to obtain freedom and obtain justice. This meant that these very strong community organizations were a potential obstacle to the dissolution of the Palestinian liberation movement that was envisioned by Oslo and was envisioned by the United States and Israel. And so we've seen that these communities have been very much targeted by this kind of legislation, and for three primary purposes. One, the repression of exile and diaspora communities to impose fear, intimidation, and political silencing. Two, separation of exile and diaspora communities from their liberation movements back home inside occupied Palestine. And three, to create a constant and legitimized pretext for prosecution of community and solidarity movements, ongoing surveillance, infiltration, and other forms of repression. And of course, this has had both an impact outside and an impact inside. When we look in both, we can say what groups are most affected by the loss of funding from grassroots communities, who can find other funding and who can't. And of course, this is to leave aside the material elements, the imprisonment of Palestinian political prisoners in US and international jails for so-called violations of the material support statute. And of course, it also forms a level of political pressure in order to be delisted, to not be listed, to be able to continue to fund organizations. And so what this does is it creates an environment of censorship and self-censorship within community organizations, so that it becomes almost inconceivable to speak about Palestinian resistance, to speak about Palestinian political organizations, and to speak about Palestinian movements. We can go in later in the question and answer to some of the specific cases that relate to this framework, but just to note that the purpose of an anti-terror law is not to of any law is not simply to punish people. It's not to go through extensive cases in court. It's to deter the behavior. And that is the case even when we are talking about a fundamentally unjust and unprincipled law. And that is the case with anti-terror laws. And I just want to conclude by saying that, as we're sitting here today, Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, the organization that I coordinate, was recently declared a terrorist organization by Israel. What does Samidoun do? We have delegations, protests, petitions, and public information about Palestinian political prisoners, nothing more. And so what we've seen not only is this attempt to intimidate and suppress, but the constantly shifting definition of the term terrorism to at this point include anti-Israel propaganda. Now, of course, that Israeli listing is combined with an attempt to export that around the world as well. And of course, Samidine's case is not stand alone. In fact, it represents an ongoing series of cases with these kinds of attacks and these kinds of repressive targeting of Palestinian movements and organizations. So thank you once again. I look forward to continuing the discussion later and further engaging and listening to everyone's insightful presentations.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting talk. And actually, I come from political science background, so I was very impressed when you used very carefully the words. So you said occupy instead of occupied Palestinian territory, you said colonized. So I was very, very impressed. You know, we should start doing this more frequently. And also the notion of silencing, you know, that you silence those who can speak, not only abroad, but also your own citizens, you know, so the tricks that have been done. So you are accused of, for example, harming the economic and security sort of interests of your own country. So it's very interesting how the politics of law, you know, started moving towards this this direction. And this brings us to Rizwan Sabir, who is actually talking about this dimension of Islamophobia in politics. And Rizwan is working in the UK, so different weather for now. He is a lecturer, assistant professor in criminology at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK. And his research focuses on critically assessing the intersection between UK counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency policy and practice that is targeted at political and armed Muslim groups. So the floor is yours, Rizwan, and please mind the time as well.
Thank you, Dr. Heba. Before I do anything, I need to close the window because
go ahead.
Yeah, we just started drilling. So give me.
We will look at the map behind you. It's very interesting.
No problem. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Heba, and of course, my heartfelt thank you to Dr. Sami for inviting me to this conference. I just want it on record that I'm very sad, even though it's very sunny here, that I can't be in Istanbul in person with all of you to talk about this subject that I want to talk to you about. So I spent a considerable amount of time going through what I should kind of talk about, and in the end, I actually had nothing on paper as to what I was going to talk about. But actually, listening to the contribution that Charlotte made has triggered an entire set of ideas because of the kind of centrality and the importance of some of the things around the criminalization of very lawful and legitimate actions and ideas, and how that's been kind of used to silence a political dissent, political protest, and of course, critique of state power, especially powerful European Western nation states. So I guess if we're talking about Islamophobia, I guess a good place to start is, what do we actually mean by Islamophobia? Now, I was going to give you a long series of definitions and kind of formal understandings around this concept, but then I thought, actually, let me just give you a story, and a true one for that. And this story starts in May 2008 in Nottingham, in the Midlands in the United Kingdom. And I turned up to university one day when I was doing my master's in international relations. And within a couple of hours of arriving on campus, I was arrested by counterterrorism police and taken into custody and held for 7 days in pre-charge solitary confinement detention. After the first day of being in custody, I came to discover that the reason why I was arrested, along with an Algerian friend of mine, who's also the editor-in-chief of the political journal Ceasefire, the reason why we were both arrested and taken into custody for terrorism was because we had a document that I had downloaded as part of my master's dissertation on Al-Qaeda and Hamas, but also an upcoming PhD in political science where I was going to be looking at Hamas and other armed Muslim groups. And it transpired that this document had actually been downloaded off the United States Department of Justice website, the State Department website, which had been made, placed into the public domain as part of the New York Embassy, trials of the East African bombings that took place in 1998. So this was a legal, lawful document to be in possession of. So when I ended up in custody, I understood that it wasn't just the individual police officers who were actually very, very respectful in the way that they behaved towards me on an individual human level, but it was actually an entire structure of power that was almost conspiring against me. And that's when I understood Islamophobia in a way, and racism in a way that I had never understood it before when I was growing up. Because for me, living in the United Kingdom, it was being called the P word, or being called Taliban, as it later on became the derogatory term. So for me, it was always individual acts. I understood structural racism because of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the kind of instrumental effect that had on public discourse in the United Kingdom. But it was actually my arrest for suspected terrorism that taught me how structures of power all intersect and come together in order to punish, in order to coerce, and in order to regulate particular bodies. Now, when we're talking about the bodies that are subjected to this form of control and coercion and discipline, who do we mean by that? And this is where the work of Mahmoud Mamdani becomes absolutely critical, the bad Muslim, so to speak. It's the bad Muslim who refuses to blindly assimilate into European culture and internalize that culture as their own, fails and refuses to actually kind of disseminate those dominant cultural stereotypes around what it means to be the good Muslim or the good immigrant, so to speak. But there was something else at stake that my arrest taught me during that moment of being in a prison cell in solitary confinement and the subsequent 13 years that have passed since then, is that it's politically active Muslims that become the target of many of these policies. And I think, you know, we're here and we're talking about my case, but there's actually another very powerful demonstration of this case that happened recently in Austria, Professor Fareed Hafiz's case. And I think, you know, you could say, oh, I was a student, that's why I was subjected to this treatment at that particular moment in history. But actually, Professor Fareed Hafiz is a professor of political science. He's an analyst of Islamophobia and racism, yet he's not given that same privilege and entitlement that his non-Muslim colleagues around the world are in many respects. So it's not just the so-called visible bad Muslim that becomes a target, but it's also the Muslim who seeks to investigate, who seeks to understand, who seeks to share that kind of understanding around what the threat is, where it may be coming from, and how we work to kind of end conflict in order to find a more just and peaceful settlement in this world. So there's a series of different individuals that are targeted for lots of different reasons. And the reason why this commitment within policy exists around targeting non-violent, politically active individuals is because the approach that is being used in the United Kingdom, but also outside of the UK, around Europe, draws its inspiration from counterinsurgency warfare. And counterinsurgency warfare, for anyone who's read any history around the colonial world, will understand that this is absolutely not a new policy. The whole idea of targeting entire pockets of the Muslim and racialized communities, whether it's Black communities in the United States in Ferguson through highly militarized policing practices, whether it's the BDS movement, or whether it's, of course, Muslim communities here in the UK. This is actually history not repeating itself, history learning from the way it's controlled and coerced and regulated, modernizing itself with the help of technology and globalization in order to exercise the same control and regulation of racialized others. So when we're talking about counterinsurgency, the reason why I'm so kind of committed to understanding counterinsurgency is because when I was arrested, there was something more at stake, because I'd never been involved in violence. In fact, I'd been involved in nothing, but I'd never been involved in anything even remotely associated with actual physical violence. So then it occurred to me, why am I and others like me being targeted for being in possession of ideas, information, and how is it possible that I have been allowed by the law of this land to be treated in this way? Because my arrest and treatment and subsequent stop and search and harassment at the roadside and at airports was completely lawful. How is this made possible? Well, this is where counterinsurgency becomes central. The first pillar of counterinsurgency warfare throughout history has been that you have to act in accordance with the law. And the entire purpose of acting in accordance with the law is to legitimize in the minds of the general population that what you are actually doing is lawful and thereby justified. So here, the law is the avenue, is the tool that is weaponized and used in order to legitimize what the state does. And, you know, this is not a profound philosophical point. History is filled with examples of how the genocide of native Indians in the US was based upon law, and how the Holocaust and transatlantic slavery and colonialism and all the other tyrannies of the world like apartheid and what's happening with the war on terror, including torture in Guantanamo Bay, of course, and black sites, is all based upon a series of laws that come together. And this is where the word of the British general, Frank Kitson, it's a quote that's embedded in my mind. My memory isn't as very good nowadays, but there's this one quote that sticks in my mind, and his quote is to say that, quote, "The law is nothing more than a propaganda cover for the disposal of unwanted members of society." So it becomes a tool through which the state exercises violence, but it becomes also a propagandistic cover to legitimize in the minds of the general population that this is what's happening and this is okay. The second principle of counterinsurgency theory, which kind of goes to the heart of what we're confronting here in the Western world and Europe especially, is this integration between civilian power and military power. And there's no better way to kind of understand this then through my own case study at Nottingham University when I'm arrested and taken into custody. You have the university management that report the discovery of this lawful, legitimate document, the Al-Qaeda training manual, who then report that to the police, and then the police execute their anti-terror operation and take myself and Hisham into custody. So we can see how that military principle around not just using the military, but actually incorporating and co-opting civilian powers into the war effort, so to speak, goes to the actual heart of what's happening when it comes down to fighting the threat of terrorism, or so-called terrorism, and political violence more broadly. Thirdly is surveillance. And the whole point and principle of surveillance goes to the heart of everything that counterinsurgency is based upon. Before you can do anything, it's absolutely critical that you understand what the problem is, where it's coming from, and how do you then use that information that you've collected in order to direct your action. So when I come to the attention of the authorities and I'm taken into custody, one of the areas that the police are very interested in speaking to me about is my political activism. And my political activism largely focuses on the Palestinian struggle during my days as a student. And in fact, I come to discover through my own research and investigations on my own case that actually prior to my arrest for suspected terrorism, wrongful arrest for suspected terrorism, actually the UK security services MI5 already had me on their record, and they had a file on me, and this file is intimately connected to a student peaceful demonstration that I participated in November 2007. So we can see how the Palestinian issue becomes a cause for surveillance, and how that surveillance data then informs further questioning and state violence and action. So we can see the three fundamental pillars of counterinsurgency warfare at play within this particular domain of counterterrorism, which is, of course, the main way through which Islamophobia is put into practice, not only here in the UK, but actually in various parts of Europe. Now, the reason why surveillance especially becomes so central to fighting this form of warfare is because it not only has a disciplinary effect in practice, but also because this entire structure that's been created to deal with the threat of armed Muslim groups and so-called suspect communities is one that's committed to preemptive action. Now, when we think of preemptive action, there's a misnomer attached to this. A lot of people in their minds think of crime prevention, right, as opposed to preemptive. Now, there's a difference, and I think it's very important to emphasize that difference. Crime prevention is about finding solutions to problems, right? So you can stop a crime from occurring, whether it's political crime or whether it's ordinary criminal behavior. You understand the situation, you understand the terrain, and you try and come up with solutions in order to find a just, lasting resolution. Preemptive, pre-criminal policing is not about finding solutions, it's about improving methodologies of control, coercion, and regulation in order to basically deal with the symptoms of a problem rather than the causes of the problem. So oftentimes surveillance has to inform a lot of the practices, because it's not about crime prevention, it's not about mapping communities with 2,000 or more Muslims so we can give them CVE prevent funding. It's actually to understand who the movers and shakers, so to speak, in those communities are, who are the individuals that can be co-opted, who are the ones that can be recruited in order to disseminate pro-government messaging. So the information that is collected is inherently weaponized, and it's not there in order to resolve a conflict. It's there in order to inform a better form of warfare. And this goes inherently to the historical practice of colonial domination. So we can see how surveillance practices that are used throughout the colonies to deal with the native racialized communities are targeted at Muslim communities in the modern day and age, because they themselves are constructed, as they have been historically, as being dangerous, barbaric savages who need to always be watched in case they turn against us. They need to be watched in case they do something that kind of undermines our civilizing mission and our supremacy, so to speak. So this kind of connects to a broader question then, that we've got this approach of fighting political violence or dealing with the threat of a particular violent phenomenon, which is based upon, of course, this highly coercive form of action and policy that's targeted at entire segments of the civilian community, right? Because if you're not engaged in planning or executing violence, then technically in legal terms, including the Geneva Convention, you are a civilian. But what we have is the emergence of new categories, legal categories, like extremism, for example. And extremism is even worse, because extremism doesn't even have a legal footing, certainly not here in the United Kingdom. There is no legal definition. We just think we know what we mean when we use the word extremist, but the reality is there is no legal definition. But what you have is, through the emergence of this kind of socially constructed idea around what an extremist looks like and who an extremist is, we have all of these policies being targeted at civilians and non-combatants, which are based upon a footing of wartime emergency powers generally and coercive action. So what is the consequence of all of this? And, you know, I've kind of laid out the groundwork on which this policy of Islamophobia, which is articulated through counterterrorism, but what's the consequence of this particular form of power? And I think the first and foremost one is fear. That when you have law and legislation in place that justifies all sorts of state violence and activity that's based not upon what you have done, but what you may do in the future, and uses your possession, for example, of ideological propaganda as a marker that you may go on to do something in the future, it generates a sense of fear, and it sends shockwaves throughout the communities who understand and have knowledge around that power and that law that the state has access to. But also at the same time, it leads to something even more harrowing, and that is it generates a sense of exclusion. It makes communities and individuals feel like that they are not a part and parcel of this part of the world or the community. And therefore they have no incentive to try and build a better world in which they will be able to benefit or have, so to speak, upward mobility. So exclusion becomes a very common kind of outcome of a lot of this policy, but also mistrust of fellow family members, friends, communities. Everybody is scared that everybody is informing on them. Everybody is afraid that somebody is making a note of what they're saying over the telephone or what they're talking over email. And this fear, this mistrust that exists has an ability to corrode and to destroy friendships and families. I mean, I myself, as a survivor of state violence in the UK, have personal lived experience of this, where I have suspected many of my own families and friends for being state security surveillance agents. Now, this is not unique to just me. If you read the literature and you read the discourse around Black communities in the US, if you read how communities have responded to surveillance and intelligence gathering by the FBI and so on and so forth, you can see that actually that traumatic harm that emerges in the minds of the people that are being targeted by this is deeply, deeply troubling and leads to long-term mental health conditions like schizophrenia, like psychosis, and so on and so forth. So this isn't just a policy that's about constructing Muslims in a negative way, or about viewing Muslims as inherently suspicious and keeping an eye on them, but that particular exercise of state power leads to an entire physical effect on real human beings. And I think that's what's forgotten in a lot of this discussion around policy, is that ultimately at the end of the day, it's real human beings that are being impacted and affected by a lot of these policies. So now I'm going to sum up and say one final thing, that a lot of the time counterterrorism is, especially here in the UK, constructed as being not only targeting Muslims, but also non-Muslim communities. The idea that counterterrorism has become colorblind. I would say one thing, even though more white people are now being referred to counterterrorism programs, it's like Charlotte said, a lot of the time, these communities are targeted in order to show the public that actually the state is doing something, when actually the structures that allow the state to carry on targeting racialized Muslim communities remain intact. So if we want to change this whole particular program of security and Islamophobia, we have to start by dismantling the myths that somehow we're all being treated the same way by the powerful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I have some comments, but I will move right away to Dr. Nazanin Masoumi, because she has to leave quite early. And we are moving very smoothly from law to politics to sociology, between brackets, education. So we are talking in this part of the panel. Professor Masoumi is talking about Islamophobia in education. Professor Nazanin Masoumi is a lecturer and British Academy and postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology, Philosophy and Anthropology at the University of Exeter. Her research focuses on racism, social movements and counterterrorism, with a current focus on researching the impact of counterterrorism policy and practice on UK higher education. She is the co-editor of What is Islamophobia, Racism, Social Movements and the State, published 2017, and the author of Muslim Women, Social Movements and the War on Terror by Palgrave Macmillan. Proud and happy to have you, Professor Masoumi, and please, the floor is yours. 15 to 20 minutes, and please mind the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thank you for the kind introduction. Just to apologize in advance, I'm actually going to have to leave in like 10 minutes because I've had a childcare crisis and I have to look after 5 children. So that's going to be a bit tricky while I'm talking. So just to say sorry that I won't be able to participate in the discussion.
Thank you for giving us the 10 minutes.
Maybe I might be speaking for a bit shorter than I would have done otherwise.
Okay.
Sorry? Okay.
So,
Anyway, so
thank you for being with us.
All right, okay, thank you. Yeah, so I have been working on researching, basically looking at higher education, and this kind of goes on from what Rizwan was saying. So it's kind of useful to follow Rizwan because he gave a sort of broader context of how these policies have worked, and he talked about how the sort of expansion of the sort of the state and counterterrorism apparatus beyond the traditional homes of the security and intelligence agencies to other spheres of public life. And my work has been looking particularly at the impact that that's had on UK higher education, and in particular looking at things like Prevent and how that's impacted the purpose of education within the UK, the way that it functions, the public role it plays, and also especially the impact that it's had on Muslims within higher education. And I will try to keep it coherent in the short time that I'm speaking, but effectively just to give some background in terms of what I've done. I've spent the last few years kind of going to sort of policy meetings and Prevent training sessions and looking at the way in which the Prevent policy has been formed and the way that it's been practiced within higher education. And I've also looked at, I've like interviewed people across higher education, done freedom of information requests, analysed the way that the policies work in those institutions. And from what I have seen, I mean, maybe it's worth giving some kind of context of what this policy means. So universities in the UK, as well as hospitals, doctors, social services, libraries, all have now a legal duty to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism, which means that those institutions need to put policies and practices into place to prove that they're complying with this legal requirement from the government. And so since that's happened, there's been like a large number of referrals of people to this kind of government's de-radicalization program. And we're currently sort of averaging about 20 people a day being referred, and this is largely a lot of children as well, including, disturbingly, children as young as 3. Now, in terms of higher education, the level of referrals to de-radicalization programs lower. The impact that it's had on higher education has been quite different. But that doesn't mean impact on higher education. In higher education, the ways in which Prevent has impacted is more around how the governance of these institutions and the way in which certain internal policies work. And that's shaped the way that people can organize meetings on university campuses. So now there's long processes of bureaucratic form filling that about whether or not you can invite an external speaker, and there's all these rules in place about holding different meetings, which obviously makes organizing political meetings on campus particularly difficult. It also means organizing political meetings about certain topics on campus particularly difficult. Meetings that are political meetings about Palestine, political meetings about Islamophobia, political meetings about counterterrorism, always go through a really rigorous or, you know, kind of vicious process of bureaucratic kind of checks, and sometimes result in events being cancelled. But there's also kind of rules about how we conduct research, about what kind of materials we're allowed to access, that we need to go on certain registers. There's law enforcement aid, security agencies and police and Prevent officials are playing more and more roles of sitting on boards and various things within the university. So you're seeing this kind of, you know, increased kind of security presence within our university campus. Now, what I found really interesting about this is that if you look at some of these policies within the Prevent program, you can see some interesting historical similarities with the kinds of policies that took place in the 1960s US as a means of managing protests against the Vietnam War. So some of the policies around managing events and things like that share really, really similar policies and around things like governance and the way that universities should be run, really, really similar to those policies. And I think what we can see, and I think the best way to understand Prevent within higher education is to think about it as a form of political repression. And in order to understand it as political repression, it requires thinking about political repression in a slightly different way than maybe people might initially assume. So rather than see it as a kind of directly violent state action, that it might involve like a sort of more reward and consequence structure. So Prevent kind of offers like initiatives for funding. It provides opportunities for certain organizations to have a platform to provide, you know, that they can provide services for the university, etc. And the second thing is that to not just think about it as a form of political repression that's put in place solely by state actors. Because if you look at the way that Prevent has been implemented in higher education, but not just in higher education, throughout the UK, it relies heavily on third-party actors, on think tanks and civil society kind of counter-extremism groups. And these people play an important role in putting in place Prevent. And the fact that they are they're sort of semi-independent, they're kind of quasi parastatal kind of actors, gives them a certain position that allows them to have a certain independence, which means that they can act in ways that the state may not want to formally act themselves, so they can kind of benefit from this kind of parastatal status by enabling them to do things that the state might not want to show explicitly that they're involved in. And these kinds of actors, so sort of neoconservative think tanks and these counter-extremism groups, engage in what a sort of social movement theorist called Myra Furey Marx says that, Myra Marx for session, sort of smack tactics. So they write kind of reports that smear Muslim organizations that say that, oh, higher education is full of these extremist events on campus, that, oh, there's a problem with segregation amongst Islamic society events on campus. And there's all these like information that they put out there that the state relies on. And this is a kind of soft repression that the state then uses to implement Prevent, which has an impact in terms of higher education of, Prevent being a repressive policy, but they're doing so with an element to which they can kind of keep their sort of accountability, some distance from accountability, because ultimately these actors, the kind of process of accountability of state actors is, practically non-existent, but certainly non-state actors there's no sort of means of democratic accountability to them. So, I've kind of summarized the kind of work, the sort of argument of how I sort of see Prevent working in higher education. And there's countless of examples of this type of activity. So you can see that if you look at Prevent training, the resources and information that they rely on are on these kind of neocon Islamophobic organizations that actively smear Muslims. A lot of that stuff is reliant on that. You can see that at a policy level, there was this extremism analysis unit within the Home Office, which was supposed to be this sophisticated unit of determining who was an extremist. They were getting their information directly from the Henry Jackson Society, which is a neoconservative think tank actively involved in writing reports that claims that certain Muslim civil society actors are extremists, etc. So you see this, the role that these actors play is that they enable the state to put in place this program of political repression, and it broadens yet again the remit of counterterrorism activity. And there isn't any mechanisms to hold them to account or any sort of transparency about the nature and role that they play within the policy formation here and the practical implementation of Prevent within universities.
Nazanin, you can go.
Sorry, I had to sum that up really quick.
I understand.
Because I have to go for my kids, but I hope that made sense. And I'm sorry to not be able to stay for the discussion. I might try and join in a little bit later when I might have a bit of time to
Okay.
see if I can catch the last bit of discussion.
Okay.
But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was excellent. Good luck with everything you're doing. I hope all goes well. Bye. You can go. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, so
Thank you.
bye. We move now to the speaker, the following speaker, Tariq Sherkawi. And I used to be always confused. Sherkawi, I assume he's Egyptian because we have this family name Sherkawi, and then I found out there are Sherkawis in Morocco. So I don't, I'm not sure if you're Moroccan, Tariq, or there are other Sherkawis in the East as well. So it's a pleasure to have you. Tariq is going to talk about Islamophobia and education. I'm sorry, in media, Islamophobia in media, and he is a manager at the TRT World Research Center, Istanbul, Turkey. He is an executive with a career that spans a range of industries, including creative industries, higher education, and the think tank industry. Dr. Sherkawi holds a PhD in media and communication studies from Auckland University of Technology, and he contributed to dozens of articles and chapters, authored and co-edited several books and publications, including The News Media at War, The Clash of Western and Arab Networks in the Middle East, published by IB Tauris 2017. And his research interests include the international broadcasting media, public diplomacy, media framing, and media military relations, especially within a Middle East context. So this sort of miskul khitam, as we say in Arabic, you know, you are going to move us with us to the media after law, politics, sociology, education, and now media. So the floor is yours, Tariq, and we're happy to have you on the panel.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for CIGA to organize this exciting and very informative gathering. Thank you for the panelists as well. So I have just a short presentation that I want to present, and you know, I would like to take this opportunity to just make some points about generally what is the contours, because I see the panelists have discussed so many things that are very, very related. I think we are all in the same on the same page, let's say. Of course, Islamophobia in the media, I mean, I wouldn't give justice to the topic in 20 minutes. You know, this is like subject of many books, subject of many research that was done. I would just go quickly over some elements that I want to cover. So basically, as you know, Islamophobia in the media now, we don't even need to, you know, like treat it as something that is new. It has been around for ages, and it has been exacerbated after the 9/11 attacks. So just quickly to see some of the research that was done. One of the relatively recent research was done by Ahmed and Mathis. They did a very, very good job in studying about 345 studies of media representations of the Muslim faith across disciplines since 2000. So from 2000 to 2016, about 345 research that was done across disciplines, across geographies. Some of them are books, some of them are articles, some of them are PhD research. And they found that the quasi-majority of the research that was done, they found elements of Islamophobia, of anti-Muslim racism that is omnipresent in the media coverage. But what is interesting also in this research is the fact that there are three elements nowadays covered when it comes to Islam and Muslims. It's migration, terrorism, and war. These are the three dimensions that are pervasive in the media environment. There is very little human dimension. There is very little of any other aspects of the religion that is being covered. I mean, it used to be in the olden days, in the 60s, etc., that, you know, Muslims or Arabs or Middle Easterns would be covered as as oil suppliers. But this element has disappeared long time ago, and now what is only existing is the trilogy: migration, terrorism, and war. What is interesting, just by the way, this research has, you know, it's one of the few that have gone through the body of literature that covers the coverage of Islam in the media studies. But they found that there is a lack, there is a gap, and it's a very interesting finding, is that this gap, even though there are so many research that was done, the books are by the dozens, and the journal articles are by the hundreds, if not by the thousands, but still there is a lack of a systematic overview of research findings and trends. And this is something that we need to definitely be working on. Just quickly, I'm sure everybody knows the Islamophobic frames that exist in the media. There's nothing new. I think Edward Said has already found that in 1981 when he issued his book covering Islam. But I think one of the just to give credit when it's due, you know, one of the studies or the reports that has reignited the discussions about the coverage of Islam and Muslims in the media was this report that was issued by the Runnymede Trust around 1997, when they titled this report, "Islamophobia, a Challenge for All of Us." And I think this publication, again, they did another one 20 years later, and they found that, you know, nothing really has changed. It's not, things have worsened since then. But there are a set of Islamophobic frames that are at play all the time. Islam is monolithic and static. Islam is separate. Muslims are the others. Islam and Muslims are inferior to the West, barbaric, irrational, primitive, sexist, misogynistic. Muslims as source of societal problems, as violent, aggressive, supportive of terrorism, anti-democratic, and then to cover the whole lot it's a menace to the West, and Muslims are engaged effectively in a clash of civilization. So I would like also to just throw some elements to the discussion in terms of in terms of theories and what's in there, because it's very important to understand the media as an ecosystem. Media is not something that you say today and it's going to be reported tomorrow. Media is much more complex than that. The ecosystem is very, very complex and has been even more complex after the digital age. So, of course, you know, media is a major player when it comes to the collective representations of society, to use the words of Durkheim. It's one of the big social processes that instill values, beliefs, and norms, and definitely this power of the media. It has so much power because it constructs meanings and symbols, and they define, the media in general define who and what get represented, who is left out of the picture, how things, people, events, relationships are represented. And this is very, very important because this is a source of so much power. And because it's a source of so much power, the media has in fact been a major tool at the hands of the ruling elites across the world, because it helps those elites to forge consensus around their political platforms, their worldviews. At the same time, it's used to downplay, denigrate other competing discourses. And power, of course, as everybody knows, is at the center of knowledge production. And because it has so much power, and because this power is a relation of domination and hegemony, so the mainstream media has become a major player when it comes to the role of public interpreter of events on behalf of power centers. Such importance and such big role means that ruling elites and the media use the media as a vehicle to convey their ideologies. And ideology just to use some very good definitions, it's to help members of a social group organize and coordinate activities that allow them to protect and carry out their interests. So it's all about domination. It's all about relations of domination. It's all about how to preserve certain ways to continue and perpetuate these dominations. And in the media, those relations and those connections and those nexuses, they are reflected primarily via the official perspective. So the official perspective is defined as the set of views, arguments, explanations, and policy suggestions advanced by those who speak for the state. There is, of course, media bias. We all know there is also a strong trend that people are no longer trusting the media for a reason or another, because it's biased, because the left would see it as there is a lot of conservative bias. The right would see a liberal bias. There's a lot of biases that exist because of certain issues, because of belonging to a certain class or certain kind of political parties. But the worst sources of bias happen when this bias is shaped by the heavy influence of government and business interests who promote political and business goals. This bias becomes systemic. And actually, when we talk about Islamophobia, it's not like many studies have reached. Unfortunately, lots of people have engaged in studying Islamophobia, but they are mostly concerned about issues of identity, nationhood, issues around citizenship, the non-acceptance of the other, etc., which is important, but it's not the main cause. It's not the problem that we are dealing with here. It's better explained. If we want to study the Islamophobia in the media, we can better understand it via an analysis of systemic and structural analysis. Of course, Orientalism, I know in other panels this was discussed. Just because it's very important, I would bring it very briefly here. Edward Said and his works are paramount to understand the kind of the meta level, the ideology that is behind the kind of we would say the meta frames, at the highest level of framing analysis, the meta frames, the Orientalist view, the Orientalist worldview is prevalent in the media. There were several studies about like how this was the case and why, and how some of the media, and including the cinema, has been tainted by Orientalist views and depictions. So the Orientalism that we're talking about, and the studies that were done by Said and others, they're very good because they uncover the meta level of the ideology, this view of the East as the other. This view has been present in academia and the cinema and media and popular culture for a long time. However, I think what is more important to highlight here is the addition of this new layer, the counterterrorism layer, the nexus between the Orientalist view and the counter-terrorist view. This marriage between the combination between the two has been really something that has shaped the discourse, the anti-Muslim discourse in the media. And now we have other problems, because, for example, some of the well-known Orientalists like Daniel Pipes and others have become suddenly overnight experts in counterterrorism. They have been brought, they have been paid, they have received a lot of money, a lot of grants, a lot of funds to actually enlighten the security apparatus about this new threat that is the so-called Muslim threat. And the problem, the shift, they brought all the baggage, all the Orientalist baggage, which in fact is built on mythologies and built on myth making. And now it has pervaded another layer, and this layer is very disadvantageous to Muslims, as some of our panelists have described. It includes legislations, preemptive incapacitations and intelligence and surveillance. So the counterterrorism apparatus has gained also enormous influence. Now we are no longer talking about like just a cultural layer that is, you know, very vaguely pervading the atmosphere. Now we are talking about policies and policy making, and now the influence have not only become confined in area studies and some theology studies in the university, but now it's more like the think tanks, the political spheres, the national security apparatus, the legal sphere, the media, the news media, as well as the right-wing social movements. And this creates a lot of problems for the media. For example, in the terrorism itself, I mean, why only terrorists who have like some Muslim affiliation are qualified by the religion? Why not all the others? Like, no one is calling Tamil Tigers Hindus, or like the Irish Republican Army as the Catholic, or the Ulster Union followers as Protestant, and or the Jewish, the Defense League members. They are no one of those. Even Timothy McVeigh, when he bombed when he attacked and did this terrorist attack back in the 90s, he was never referred to as a Christian militia member. So this appellation, this kind of peculiar and very, very weird kind of symbols that are associated even in the counter-terrorist lingo, and the inconsistencies are something that are I think that are brought to the sphere because of this nexus between the Orientalist practitioners and academics with the counter-terrorist apparatus. And this is why we have this phenomenon of having overblown proportions of when it comes to covering terror attacks done by somebody who has a Muslim name. So Newsweek, for example, in February 2nd, 2019 said, quoting a recent research, of course, that Muslim terror attacks get 357% more media coverage than those by other groups. And we have seen it so many times. I'm just here refreshing the memories. Of course, Islamophobia is not just a philosophical discussion. We're not talking about just academic, we are sitting in ivory towers. It has effects on the ground, whether it's the conduct of wars, the torture, the rendition programs, the extrajudicial killings, the drone warfare, and even in the daily lives of Muslims, as some of our panelists have already mentioned, like the prevent programs, the harassment, discrimination, the hate speech, the hate crimes that are occurring. All of this, media is a partner in those crimes because they facilitate, they made themselves available for this. And we have so many polls that shows how the public, the general members of the public have been so much hyped by the propaganda emanating from the media that now, like there is this Pew Research Center survey in 2017 that like the Americans, they give Muslims the lowest ranking in the so-called feeling thermometer. From 0 to 100, the Muslims got a rating of 48. There is a slight improvement from a few years before, but it's still very, very low. A lot of half of American adults say Islam is not part of mainstream American society. Similar other polls in Europe, 42% of Europeans believe that Islam is incompatible with the values and cultures of their countries. 55% of those surveyed feel that immigration from countries with the Muslim majority should be totally prohibited. So we see these effects are real. These are tangible. It affects the day-to-day lives, not only of Muslims overseas, but also Muslims within the confines of the Western societies. And studying Islamophobia is studying media biases. Islamophobia in the media comes under the larger corpus of media bias in the media. And there were so many studies before about biased communication, but what we have is a more form of biased communication. It's no longer just the normal bias that could happen here and there, but now it's in the past 20 years, it's a mobilized form. It happens every day. It happens across the media. It's so pervasive, and it cannot happen only if there are forces behind this mobilization. So there were other studies and other bodies of research within the media studies that try to understand the phenomenon. And I think one of the most important ones are those who resort to framing research. So framing research is a powerful tool. It has been used by so many studies that deal with the representation of Islam and Muslims in the media. There is another one also, political economy of the media, which is why it's very important. It's because now we are dealing with not just studying the discourse or the language, we're studying also the connection of the media and the distribution of social and political power in society. And those tools are very, very important. They're increasingly used by researchers. Remember the first slide, that research, it used, it found out that among the 345 research that was analyzed, about half of them, or 60% of them, used framing in their approach to detecting the bias against Muslims and Islam in media. So among the books or the research that were done that had that have a very important role to understand the nexus between how the media operates and the key determinants of news coverage, you have Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media by Herman and Chomsky. This is a very important book. Why? Because for the first time, the issue is no longer about the journalists, whether they cover themselves or whether they have biases or whether they have opinions. Herman and Chomsky, they managed to put their hands on the systemic problems that are present in the majority of the news media. So just to move, so one of the things that, why it's important, they come with this theory of media filters that, in fact, before having anything on a newspaper or on a broadcasting screen or even on digital formats, the news outlets, they have several essential structures that are combining to give this news production. So ownership is number one, and this is when one scholar or a practitioner wants to analyze the content of media. The first thing is the ownership. Who owns? Because money, power, influence, political connections, relations with the banking industry, licensing, all that are very important to the media owners, and therefore they won't risk anything that harms the business unless there is a strong reason for that. So ownership will influence the content 100%. Advertising, so media outlets, essentially they sell consumer audiences to advertisers. Therefore, if something that is being carried out by the media is not to the like of certain corporate advertisers, then this thing would be dropped. Then the sources, every media has sources, and they cannot come with any story unless it's backed by sources. This is again another aspect that is important in the influence of governments and specific interest in how the media are framing the news, and these sources are very important in determining what comes as news and what doesn't come as news. Then there is the flag. Flag is the criticism that comes from those in power. It can not just be verbal criticism; it can be also threats and other mechanisms that will be used to curtail certain behaviors that the people in power don't like in certain media. We have seen this times and again. I won't just stop this. Maybe we can discuss it further later on. And then there is the ideological filter. Initially, when the book came in 1988, the main problem was the Soviet Union and communism. So this has been since updated Some people, they say prejudice against Islam or the war on terror has filled the otherness spot. Of course, there are other theories, the cascading model, which shows how things are done in terms of framing. It comes from the top and goes down to the bottom. The thing is that this model has been produced in 2004 and is still very valid. It shows how the elites have a very important role in framing. For example, when George W. Bush says, you are either with us or with the terrorists, this is a very important frame. Everybody will pick it up, and the officials and other elites, congressmen, other official experts, and the media will carry it downward to reach the general public. So of course, the ownership is a major problem. We in the West, in the United States, studies are showing that 90% of the media is owned by about 6 corporations. It's huge. And when we say this, it's not only the press, it's not only the radio, it's not only the broadcasting, it's not only the things that we think are old media, even new media, internet, satellite, broadcasting, everything goes. So 6 corporations own about 90% of US media. And this shows that the deregulation and the merger, the mega mergers that are happening and still happening, have a major effect in what kind of news do we get. Of course, you all know about Robert Murdoch and his News Corp. Is a major problem, and he's a major carrier of Islamophobia. For example, just a study that was done in Australia. There are other studies across North America, Europe, etc. But in Australia, a discursive analysis of 6 owned newspapers by Murdoch have shown that about 2,891 negative stories about Islam and Muslims in a single 12-month period, which represents about 8 stories per day. So this is an academic research. It shows that there are 8 stories per day. So the population is bombarded every day with negative stories on Muslims and Islam, and this create the hype that goes, and the hatred and all the policies and all the kind of mobilized hatred that's happening around the world. Second filter that we talked about is about the advertising and how advertisers have paid the huge amounts to see their commercials. They don't want those commercials to feature in a non-business friendly environment. So some people might think that this is just happening in like very authoritarian societies, etc. It's not true, because in the United States there are like hundreds of examples. In 2001, when Bill Maher at that time with his program Politically Incorrect tried to criticize just the war on terror, and it was September 17, major advertisers dropped from his program, and the show was eventually canceled. So this is just a small example, but there are dozens more. Sourcing is another problem, because the media, the news media, they will bring people who they call the authorized knowers. So the authorized knowers are the people who speak on behalf of the state or are very liked by the state when they come, and it's an organizational and occupational routine within the newsroom. So those are sources also of additional power used by elites to put certain values.
Dr. Sami, I'm sorry to interrupt, but please, can you bring
yes.
it to a close? You of course,
yes.
from Masoumi's
yes.
So to be fair,
no problem
to
at
the
all.
discussants, so that we have more time
no
for
problem. No problem. Sorry if
No, it was very interesting.
Yeah, so just to close, I don't want to delve further on this. We can discuss it later. But just when we talk about sourcing, imagine that, for example, when there was the Muslim ban, and it's something about Muslims. But then how many Muslims were guests on cable news to discuss this? I mean, it's pathetic, like 8%, less than 8% on all, including CNN, including Fox, including, so the left, the right, the sources are there, you know, these are the statistics. It shows that there is a huge discrepancy, and of course, we can talk and on and on and on, but yeah, I will close at this and we can discuss later in the discussion.
Can you please stop
Thank
sharing
you.
the screen?
Yes,
Kindly, so
immediately.
we can see the nice faces of everyone.
Yes.
Okay. Before we move to the discussion, I can actually start with a question received to Dr. Tariq, which is, how do you think that we can face Islamophobia specifically inside the Muslim majority countries? So I just wanted to start from the back. You know, I received this question, and add to it actually the role of minorities that left the Muslim majority countries to the West. So I can speak yani later, maybe in another event, on the role of the media by Christians of the Arab world, for example, to sort of raise the flag of Islamophobia, because they claim that they moved because of discrimination. So in their media outlets and in their Facebook pages, etc., there is always that the sort of demonization of Islam and the Muslim world and the societies they left behind, etc., paralleled, interestingly, with a very ultra-nationalist discourse supporting authoritarian regimes. So it's a very interesting topic here. Okay. Can you answer this? And then we move to other questions to the other speakers.
So sorry, I didn't hear the question. Can you just, was it for me or was it for someone else?
Yes. So I started with you, and then we will move to other questions as well.
Okay, so can you please remind me?
Islamophobia in Muslim majority countries. And then I added a comment on the non-Muslim minorities from the Muslim world in the West, that they sometimes aligning with the ultra-right movements and promoting Islamophobia.
Yes, well, I think the war on terror, when it started, it gave a very, very good pretext for other forces, even not just in the West, but also in majority Muslim countries. Those majority Muslim countries have a problem in their hands. They have legitimacy problems because most of those countries are non-democratic. Most of them are ruled by either families or by non-democratic elites, sometimes military elites. So they have these problems, and they have oppositions. These oppositions are regularly repressed. So they thought this is a good idea to jump in the bandwagon. You know, there is the United States would come with full force against Islam and Muslims. Those dictators or authoritarian forces within the Muslim majority countries, they think, oh, this is a good opportunity. We can get some help, and then we can brand these guys. Even if they are fighting for democracy, we're gonna brand them as terrorists, and then we will win all the budgets and all the support, military and other intelligence, and all the things that we can get. So from this, of course, because the media in Muslim majority countries are mostly linked to the state, and they cannot operate without really the support either from advertising or from other, the licensing, all that. So they are extremely under pressure. There is no rule of law almost in many countries, and therefore they have to abide by whatever the elites are saying in these countries. And when they start about this Islamophobic discourse, because there are a lot of parties that embrace an Islamic identity and are fighting against the dictatorships, so the discourse start being also implemented in those countries. And yeah, it might sound really weird to listeners and viewers from in the West to know that there's as much Islamophobia sometimes in some countries that it is in others, but it's the bandwagon created by the war on terror, and which continues unfortunately until today.
I think it also because it was touched upon by Charlotte, which is the economic factor. We usually focus on the political and cultural, and sometimes religious, but the economic factor sometimes some elites promote a perspective or a view of Islamophobia because it serves their coalitions and alliances in the economic domain to present themselves as sort of supporting specific interests of the countries they are dealing with. So they promote this perspective. Charlotte, you have a question that is overlapping with Dr. Tariq, which is definitely from the laws that you discussed. Journalists sometimes suffer. So how can the counterattack? How can the defense of such basic rights and standing against Islamophobia create actually on the other side alliances between like journalists, lawyers, judges, and other groups? And there was another question to you. It's like, why do people within the legal system, why don't they stand against it like judges and courts, for example? And how can again such stances materialize? I mean, how can we find some sort of a counter way to this Islamophobia structural changes in the legal domain?
Sure. Well, I think it's, the thing is that anti-terrorism laws and the kinds of laws we spoke about are only a portion of the types of repressive legislation that form a consistent, political strategy, as Rizwan was saying, a counterinsurgency strategy, that all of these are part of a political mechanism. So like, if we think that they're applying the law neutrally and naturally, then yeah, it doesn't make sense that some journalists are prosecuted for pursuing leaks while others are not. But it does if we think of these prosecutions as fundamentally political acts. And it's important to note in terms of like anti-terror law in particular, challenges to the designation of specific organizations are often met with an attempt to remove this from the matter of kind of legal review by referring to it as a foreign policy matter. So in 1999, for example, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was removed from the anti-terror list. And the reason that was given for this, and really quite openly, it's available in kind of a Congressional Research Service papers reports, is that this was part of the negotiations for a new series of quote unquote peace talks. And, the DFLP had not been active in terms of armed struggle. And so this was also meant as a mechanism to enable Palestinian Authority leadership to bring the DFLP onto their side. In other words, it was entirely an exercise of foreign policy and not in any way what one might consider a legal standard of fighting terrorism, because this area of foreign policy is kind of carved out in US law as something that cannot be litigated through the courts. And so that's another kind of attempt to create a bulwark here. Now, in terms of, material support is extremely broad. In most things that could be called material support are not prosecuted, because the purpose of this law is to recreate and reshape movements and communities in their expressions. It's not simply to prosecute people. It's not simply to throw people in jail. Now, there are really important cases of people who are in jail. Like there's the Holy Land Foundation 5, who are 5 Palestinians who are serving up to 65-year sentences in US prisons and maximum security prisons for literally doing charitable work. And even in their case, they were accused of doing charitable work. They were not accused of engaging in armed struggle. They were not accused of shipping weapons. But the argument that the government used in this case was that because the government was alleging that the charitable associations that they provided money to were associated with Hamas, even though the US government through USAID had actually given money to the same charitable institutions, that therefore this freed up the funds of the organization to engage in other efforts, and further that it helped to improve its image and its presence within Palestinian society. And on this basis, people are serving 65-year sentences in US prisons on the basis of what is almost clearly kind of an extra legal argument. Now, it's important to note that juries in a lot of these cases, especially in the early 2000s, did push back against these verdicts. That's why we saw, for example, in the Alarian case, which is a paradigmatic example of these prosecutions in the United States, we saw that juries weren't willing to convict people necessarily on these dubious charges. And so what we've seen is in these test cases where there's really a point that's trying to be made, and there's really an attempt to create fear in the community and teach a lesson through making a point in these cases, that the government will bring new charges again and again if there is a mistrial, or they will find a new mechanism of prosecuting the same person for another alleged offense. And so this is, you know, it's a legal battle. It's absolutely a legal battle, but it's also first and foremost, I think, a political battle, and the legal battle has to take place within that framework. Now, of course, Palestinian diaspora organizing efforts and networks continue to emerge. You know, just like Israel didn't manage to suppress Palestinian organizing through 72 years of occupation and colonization, neither to have anti-terrorism laws. There is legal pushback. I mean, I know the Coalition for Civil Freedoms is one of the co-sponsors of this event, and they're doing tremendous work in fighting back against these cases. And there are many dedicated lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild and elsewhere who are fighting back against this. And of course, there are community organizations doing the same thing. But I think fundamentally, what's really important is that when we build movements, whether that's Palestine solidarity movements, Palestinian community organizing, that it is important to stand with those who are targeted. And it is important to fight back against these laws in all of their forms, because one of the purposes of this type of legislation is to isolate those who are being framed as defenders of terrorism or supporters of terrorism or potential threats, so that others are too afraid to stand with those victims lest they be targeted themselves. And so only by building the strongest collective solidarity that isn't confined only to the targeted, marginalized groups in question can we fight back against this. And this means standing with those who face those allegations, rather than kind of standing to the side and criticizing and saying, oh, well, perhaps they shouldn't have done this and they should have done that instead. Yeah. Because only by, you know, this is a matter of defending our political prisoners as a movement for social justice around the world. And so we cannot win this battle without building collective solidarity. Legal challenges are important, but they're not enough, and they won't be alone, because these are not simply legal cases, they are political cases, and they are mechanisms of war and empire.
I think that you are a very good example yourself, Charlotte. Yani, God bless you for, you know, moving on different platforms and trying to bring different efforts together. I think that what is also like a thread running through the four presentations is the structural dimension of Islamophobia. It's not just, you know, statements, it's not an image in the media only, but it's like how news are made, how they are manufactured basically, and how laws are sort of biased in their own making, and how the system of picking on a suspect like Rizwan's experience, for example. Let me turn to you, Rizwan, and ask a question that was posed in the chat about the importance of social groups solidarity. And I build on what Charlotte just said. How can people in the communities that are targeted with the intention to spread fear and to distance people from those who are actually the victims, etc., how can communities sort of retaliate? How can communities lobby? How can communities act instead of just, you know, hiding or trying to feel safe being distant from the scene? In your case, for example, the Muslim communities that are living in they are citizens. They can use all the different rights. And yesterday, someone was commenting on some very racist statements by French officials And he was wondering, he said, why aren't Muslims on the street? I mean, I can't understand if this has been targeting in any other group, you know, social group, syndicate sort of association or anything, they would have been on the street. Why aren't Muslims on the street, you know? So why do Muslims, while they are enjoying the rights of citizenship, not using whatever tools they have in such communities?
Okay, so it's an excellent question, and there's a lot to unpack. I guess one of the reasons why Muslims are not protesting is the same reason why most other communities are also not protesting about so many issues that directly impact them. One reason is broadly connected to the point that I think all communities, to one sense, feel that they won't be directly affected and impacted by these policies. So they somehow hold on to that false sense of security that it's okay if I just kind of mind my own business, get on with life, be the good Muslim, nothing really will happen to me. And that's not generally a kind of mechanism for safety. That just basically means you're allowing the system and the structure to continue to implement so many repressive and coercive broad policies that can be targeted towards you in many ways. So I think a good example of this is so many of the policies that have now been implemented over the last 20 years to deal with so-called armed Muslim groups and Muslim political activism have been now extended to middle-class white women campaigning against violence against women in central London. But a lot of those women did not stand in solidarity with Muslim communities when those policies were being introduced by the UK government, because they weren't going to affect them directly. At least that's what they thought. So one of the kind of key take-home points about political activism and kind of advocacy work is that we have to work together, even though there may not be a direct threat to our sanctity and our safety at the moment, but it's only a matter of political decision making that can come to knock on our doors very directly. The second point that I want to make around this question of resistance, because ultimately for me that's what it comes down to, how do we resist this form of structural Islamophobia? I think one of the key modes of resistance has to be through storytelling. And I think Muslims and other racialized communities, including especially the Black community, have countless examples of where they have faced state violence, whether it's a stop and search on the street, whether it's a detention at an airport, whether it's a detention at another airport in another country because of the skin color or because of their name is Muhammad or Hussein or whatever it may be. And I think what those stories do is they let people know that, look, firstly, the effects of these policies and practices is very real, and that it has a very direct human impact. And thirdly, it lets everybody know who is paying attention to that story that this isn't just some theoretical point, but it's real. And actually, you may not think that you were a racist or an Islamophobe when you executed a stop at a border, but actually you contributed. You drew upon those informal codes and stereotypes in order to view me in this particular way and to subject me to this coercive act of state violence. So I think when we're talking about resistance, we have to work together in solidarity, sometimes with communities which we think are fighting for a cause that might not come to impact us. So that means in particular, struggling with the civil rights, Black Lives Matter movement in particular, in order to demonstrate how this military security structure impacts us all as racialized communities here in the UK and Europe. And secondly, to make those stories visible that are oftentimes not spoken about. The reality is that power and structures of power rely on people who are victimized by that power to not speak out. And I think what makes my story unique in this respect is not that I have experienced 7 days of pre-charge detention for suspected terrorism. The figures in the UK show that over 3,000 people have been arrested and then released without charge since 9/11. What makes the story unique is that I have an ability and the tools to articulate my anger and frustration and sadness at this particular experience. And if the 3,000 people who have experienced this also did the same, we'd have a very different understanding of what counterterrorism is, what security policy is, and what it actually seeks to do. So I think making visible stories that oftentimes remain hidden and not spoken becomes a key way of articulating resistance. And I can guarantee you there is almost, an endless list of stories that racialized communities and Muslims have gone through and experienced at the hands of the coercive arm of the state, that they could use in order to make visible how this violence works.
I have an interesting question coming to my WhatsApp here from a friend, and she's following us, and she's saying, why don't Muslims, or even those who are supporting the cause of such victims, like Charlotte and other friends and activists in the global civil society or so, use different tools? So, for example, creative writing, documentary short films that sort of put forward the voice of those who are victims, because making a statement or giving a speech, it reaches a small audience at the end of the day. But creative writing, visual sort of arts, even drawings, caricature, and other types can spread across social media and have an impact. Why don't we see more of that happening outside the mainstream academic research or something like that? I think the question is addressed to all of you.
Can I go first on this? Because what I should have added the caveat that my story is articulated and expressed in an academic way, but that's not to discount the countless musicians, rappers, artists, theatre actors that have expressed their stories and their experiences based upon their own realities, but also the conversations they've had. So this is just one mode or one tool of resistance. And secondly, I would say this is probably more Tariq's territory, but the reality is when you're telling a counter-hegemonic story, Tariq mentioned in his paper that actually the media industry reflects the interests of the powerful as opposed to the powerless. So as a result of being victimized by the state means that your story is going to be received with a lot more skepticism, especially if there is the terrorism symbol that's associated with your name, because nobody wants to be associated with being responsible for giving the bad person a platform and an avenue. So there are strategic, political, economic interests at play in whether those stories are vocalized. But I guess the trick is to try and use the small amounts of spaces that we increasingly have less access to now, to the best of our abilities, and to work to our strengths, whether it's music, whether it's rap, whether it's theatre, whether it's academia for your sins.
Tariq? You need to unmute yourself, please.
Well, definitely agree with Rizwan. I think the premise of having something more creative, very attractive. Everybody wants to do that, and there are a lot of attractive minds around. But there are many issues, and it's not as easy as it sounds. First of all, I would think the communities, especially the Muslim communities in the West, elsewhere, they need a sort of a mindset shift. Because right now, if you ask people to donate for something like a mosque or something, you immediately have donations, and it can be a successful endeavor. But if you ask them to do like a museum or something like a traveling exhibition about war crimes or something, I mean, how many people would you know personally that would pitch in for such something like that? So we need definitely a mindset shift. That's first of all. Second of all, media is a tricky territory. It's not as I try to explain, and I think it was well received, that it's a defined territory where power plays a big role. Of course, now there are some avenues where you can do some few things via social media, etc., and it can be successful. However, it needs a lot more. Also some being savvy about other rules of the game, and also bringing other members, not just the Muslim community, other exactly as Rizwan said, we need the outreach campaigns. We need to have a lot more people on board and be in solidarity with other causes, even if they don't have necessarily similar problems to ours or have any impact on us. But we have to be proactive. It's partly some of the things to do, but also we have to understand, and this is my third point, is that we have to build an ecosystem. Actions like that, like, okay, I'm gonna do a good doco, or I'm gonna do a nice rap music. It's just like, these are just episodic moments. They go and they are short-lived, and with the media, how things are going, anything you do is just, it's 1 week of fame maximum, and then it will die down. So you need first to build an ecosystem, and this ecosystem, it starts also by building think tanks that are dedicated. For example, not many people have thought about putting an institute for propaganda analysis. I mean, how come we are the recipient of so much hatred and so much denigration and so much vilification in the media, and then there is no permanent institution to study these things and provide a platform for think tankers, for people who can articulate these views in the media, even if there are not many venues for that, but you can create some new opportunities and build the momentum out of that. Plus, this ecosystem, you also need not just the think tanks, you need like a lot more platforms. It can be a digital platform, but this needs financing. Again, we come back to the point number one. I mean, we need a mindset shift, and we need to make sure that finances are reaching some very important avenues that are not being
regarding the ecosystem that you mentioned. I wanted to ask you, actually, when you were speaking, it crossed my mind, are there any sort of cooperations between something like TRT and Al Jazeera, for example, to sort of coordinate news coverage, or to produce together documentaries? Or it's like everyone is working sort of on their own, with their own budget, with their own political calculations, under their own national ceiling, But are there some sort of cooperations? Because this happens all the time in other platforms.
Yes, it's a very good question. Of course, there are some cooperations, but I would say it's rather limited, because at the end of the day, the notion of nation state is that, for example, TRT is a public sector organization. We are funded by a taxpayer. So first we have to define what we want from any cooperation, something that will benefit the public here. Otherwise, we will be asked about every penny and every energy or any resources that is driven in certain projects. Islamophobia is growing. The momentum for fighting Islamophobia in many platforms is growing, but it's still in its nascent
label it basically as against national security here as well. You have to
yes. I think it's starting, and definitely for example,
in the case of Turkey, it's hitting the Turks in Germany. So these are citizens as well, by the way.
Absolutely.
Sometimes they have dual citizenship, and
Absolutely. No, I'm saying it's starting to be important, but it, to be transmitted, as in every bureaucracy, from the idea to the practice, it will need a couple of, of years. I think Al Jazeera also has a different mindset. They are more like on the political realm. They don't want to do something that's more like partisan-like, or something like an NGO type. So it will take time to really do something that is tangible, but there is a lot of cooperation, but not on this level.
Okay, Charlotte, there is a question for you regarding law and ethics. So a lot of laws that you have mentioned are unethical. So the question is wondering, how can a higher moral ground be claimed by those who are acting against these? So it's not only the legal, that this is against the constitution or so and so, but also the moral discourse, you know, how it can turn against these actions and policies.
Absolutely. And I think that it's, ethics and morality is kind of one of the grounds on which this battle is being fought because, of course, what we're looking at here is the ethics of people, the ethics of justice, the ethics of humanity, but that isn't the ethics of empire, the ethics of domination, the ethics of racism and a systemic repression. And so just like has been discussed many times, this kind of repression is systemic. It's not just an individual case and it's not just a particular politician kind of going off. Like when we see far right parties, for example, in France or Germany or the United States engaging in certain kinds of rhetoric, we can kind of engage in various forms of argumentation about how awful this obvious and apparent racism is. Yet, nevertheless, regardless of whether this right-wing party wins at the election, Macron's election in France was supposed to be a defeat for the far right. But what we're seeing now is the use of the dissolution law to dissolve groups. And organizations, particularly those in Muslim communities, particularly those also in formerly colonized communities from Northern Africa that are specifically targeted for this kind of repression. So that was, that those who claim the moral high ground against the far right are those who are engaging in the same form of repression that was heralded, just using different language for the same policies. And so I think it is necessary, though, for us to claim to fight back at all levels against this form of distortion of ethics. There are, again, many lawyers, also many artists. I mean, Loki's song Terrorist has kind of been an anthem for, I think, these kinds of struggles for many people in many years. And I've both been to and done presentations about this topic where, that song is kind of played and performed and continues to have resonance like 10 years after it was released the first time because of the power of that kind of creative work. But just to say, like, yeah, it should be an ethical call and responsibility to anyone engaged in law or the practice of law to fight back against this kind of designation, to fight back against this kind of marginalization and racism and repression. But it's also like a responsibility, for example, to uphold, for example, the Palestinian right to resist. So what we see is kind of inversion of reality that takes place, whereby a colonized people fighting for their freedom is labeled as immoral, unethical, dangerous terrorism, and an occupation, an apartheid regime is labeled as as a moral example that the world can learn from. And so it's kind of the concept of Malcolm X, that you'll find yourself, loving the oppressor and hating the oppressed. And so it's so necessary to reclaim that ground on all levels, not only in terms of these specific laws, but also in terms of the political and ideological frameworks on which these laws are constructed. Because it's not just that these laws are aberrations in a constitutional society, it's that they are mechanisms of waging war and empire.
Well, I think we have to bring this session to a close. I'm sorry that Masumi did not manage to join again. She obviously had an issue with one of her children, and we sent her our love and support, a positive energy. And I've been very honored to, even on the personal level, to get to know you. I hope we stay in touch. Tariq, you are in Istanbul, so we might have a cup of tea together or something. And
Yes, with pleasure.
Charlotte, it has been a real honor personally to get that our roads crossed. We'll stay in touch, inshallah. Rizwan, I will follow up with you on creative writing and rap music so that I can forward it to my students and maybe they become interested in that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Obaid, for following and forwarding the questions to me. Thank you, Dr. Sami, for the invitation and organization, and for everyone, and for the followers, and for those who will check on that video later. And I leave you in peace, inshallah. Thank you very much. See you, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Good luck, CIGA, with the following panel.
Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.